Well, hey all. Welcome back to Star Trek Stories. I'm your creator and host, Jaron Hatch. Well, believe it or not, everyone, we have just finished another batch of episodes. And not just any batch, mind you, but our final batch for our 100 episode Star Trek list we've been working on. Wow. Exciting times. If you are new to the podcast, we have spent the last 2.5 years or so watching through a curated list we have titled Venturing Through the Universe. In this list, we are exploring the entire Star Trek franchise, starting from its inception in 1964 and ending in 2022 with the first episode of the most recent incarnation. This is a list designed for both newbies and fans, and is a kind of imperfect snapshot of the franchise to give us a good sense of the whole thing. So if you're new, there's a lot to catch up on. We have split this list into a few different parts and eras. The first batch was dedicated to classic Trek, which is everything with the 1960s cast and comprises Star Trek the Original Series, Star Trek the Animated Series, and the original run of theatrical films. Then we spent the next 6 batches of episodes exploring the giant middle era of the franchise, Golden Age Trek, that magical time from 1987 through 2005 when there was constant Star Trek on, and it was at the height of its popularity. In those batches, we covered Star Trek The Next Generation, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Voyager, and Star Trek Enterprise, as well as the Next Generation run of theatrical films. And finally, we just finished up our last batch of episodes, this one looking at the current era, modern Trek. Everything from 2009 through to the present day. This was a 10-episode look at the beginnings of all the different series of this modern streaming Star Trek universe. We watched Star Trek Discovery, Star Trek Picard, Star Trek Lower Decks, Star Trek Prodigy, and Star Trek Strange New Worlds. And that's not all. We also watched the first of the reboot Star Trek films with Chris Pine, as well as a little short from Star Trek Short Treks. Lots of different shows for this chunk. When we first set up this batch of episodes, we talked about how this era is defined by this notion of not having just one marquee Star Trek series for a wide audience, but multiple series targeting multiple different audiences, trying to expand the brand, as it were. To reflect that in our batch, rather than having a dedicated co-host with me, we instead had multiple test audiences to do a kind of pilot season to see the responses these shows got. It's been interesting seeing the reactions to all of this. Very briefly, I'd say the overall response to this era, at least these episodes we watched, has been mixed. First, we watched the 2009 Star Trek film, which is essentially what laid the creative and tonal groundwork for this whole era. We had a little group watching that one. We had my girlfriend Jenny, who had seen it before, and it was actually her first exposure to Star Trek when we first started dating. We also had her other partner, Dallas, on as well. Dallas is definitely a Star Trek noob. Up to this point, I think he's only seen a couple of episodes of Next Generation, Darmok, and then when he was on the podcast for The Wounded. Dallas is definitely a movie nerd. but a more serious one. Dallas is the kind of guy you watch Kurosawa's Ron with. Not exactly a Hollywood blockbuster, but certainly an epic film. In addition, we also had my best friend and work buddy Toby on. Toby is also a Star Trek noob. They were on previously for the Deep Space Nine episode Duet, which I do believe was their very first episode of Star Trek ever. Toby is also a nerd, also more on the kind of serious side of nerddom, very much a literary nerd. Toby's the kind of person you talk to Crime and Punishment with. We also had Toby's partner Natty on. Natty is also a Star Trek noob. Natty believes she has seen one of these Chris Pine films, but when we watched this one, she didn't think it was this one. So one of the other two, but is more or less also a Star Trek newbie. But Natty's definitely a nerd. Natty puts her, I think, is the kind of nerd who will put their fingers in lots of different kind of nerddoms. So yes, a bunch of nerds who are mostly new to Star Trek, which is in many ways the target audience for this 2009 blockbuster reboot. I remember when this came out, there was definitely a lot of excitement when this came out. Lots of hype. And I remember going opening night to go see this with a bunch of my friends who had never seen Star Trek. And I remember at the time, after that midnight showing, there were friends of mine who came away thinking it was really fun, and there were even some curious to check out some of the older stuff. This time around with this group, I'd say the response was more muted, neutral, kind of going up into somewhat positive is where I would say this ended. I would say everyone had fun, some more than others, but no one was really wowed by it or really like champing at the bit to see more. And I think everyone also more or less agreed that this felt more like a Star Wars movie than what they would expect from something like Star Trek. Which is interesting. In many ways, that was the intent from the filmmakers and the studio. J.J. Abrams has gone on record as not really being a Star Trek fan and was much more of a Star Wars fan and always wanted Star Trek to be a little more like Star Wars. And I think that's really what the studio wanted. And so they hired J.J. Abrams to direct it, who would go on to direct future Star Wars films. Which on some level makes sense if you don't really understand these franchises. If you're just like, well, let's make Star Trek more like Star Wars. That's the big popular one, right? But I feel like these two things are fundamentally pretty different. I'm not sure. You know, when people are walking away from this thinking it felt like a Star Wars film, I'm not exactly sure that's what you want to hear from your audience, that you're hoping to get into Star Trek. I feel like on some level, it's like, look, if you're going to do a Star Trek film, especially with all the pre-existing stuff, you're going to want people to also kind of check that stuff out. That would also propel you to come see new stuff, like a feedback loop, get you like into the Star Trek ecosystem. So yeah, I don't know if people coming away thinking this felt like Star Wars is really actually what you want, because then why wouldn't you just go watch Star Wars? So a somewhat positive, but kind of confused kickoff to this whole era, I would say. After the movie, we then jumped into the first two episodes of Discovery, The Vulcan Hello and Battle of the Binary Stars. And like we talked about in those 2 episodes are essentially a prologue to this show. They more or less kind of set up the main conflict that's going to be happening in season 1 and sets up where our main character is when the show really starts in the 3rd episode. So yeah, I kind of like 2-part prologue. And Discovery is the show that kicked off this whole streaming era. So this was definitely a big deal when it was happening. I definitely remember this coming out and all of us at the old boys' house being like, oh boy, here we go. First time we've had Star Trek on TV in over 10 years. For this one, our friends Salem and Rachel Murtaugh came on to watch with us. Salem is definitely a Star Trek fan, but is mostly limited to TOS and DS9, which is a kind of an interesting flavor of Star Trek fan. Rachel is definitely more of a casual fan. They grew up with things like TNG and especially Voyager, but they would not categorize themselves as a hardcore fan. Though Rachel is definitely a nerd who likes all kinds of genre fiction. So yeah, Discovery. Discovery is Star Trek's take on a gritty, modern, prestige genre show in the vein of Game of Thrones, at least in its earlier seasons. Salem was intrigued by the first episode, but by the second one, overall thought it was mid. Rachel, however, also intrigued by the first one and was actually pretty positive by the end of the second. They said this kind of show was definitely their jam. I think they like the high intensity drama of it all. Though both of them said this didn't quite feel like Star Trek. It felt very subversive. But for Rachel, that was why they ended up liking it so much. But they did say if they were trying to come at this as a Star Trek show, they don't know how well it functions as a Star Trek show, but as kind of just like a gritty prestige genre show, they thought it was more successful in that sense. And I would say that's kind of where Salem is as well, but with Salem being more of the Star Trek fan and Rachel being more of just the kind of genre fan, that definitely colored their experiences. Salem being less positive, kind of more neutral, and Rachel actually being very positive. So we ended up with a somewhat positive reaction to this overall, which is better than I thought it would be, honestly. Then we had our one little Short Treks episode, Children of Mars. That one was just me, and I was pretty on it. It was definitely a thing I watched. Honestly, Short Treks as a whole is mostly just a nothing burger, and while Children of Mars had some interesting stuff, again, mostly just a little nothing burger. So it's hard to be really positive or negative on it. You just come away feeling really neutral on it, is how I feel. It is a thing. Though I will say Short Treks is technically my least favorite Star Trek series, but only because it's barely a thing. The most interesting thing about Children of Mars is that it's a kind of prelude or teaser for the then upcoming Picard, which is what we watched next. We had a 3-episode run of Picard. Picard is the subversive legacy sequel, which were very much in vogue at the time, and you still definitely see them now. We watched Remembrance, Maps and Legends, and the end is the beginning. These 3 episodes were described by the showrunners at the time as essentially being Act 1 to the first season. So we watched all of them to give the show a fair shake. Picard is very serialized, so it felt also appropriate to watch 3 of them to get a sense of the serialization that is so part and parcel to the show. Our good friends of the podcast, Tyson Baker and Ellen Marie Lewis, were here watching those with us. Everyone was cautiously optimistic after the first one, and then our opinions tanked with the second, but then slightly improved by the third. I think we were all pretty unanimously somewhat negative on Picard, if not fully negative on it. We did have some, we all had little things we liked, but overall, somewhat negative on it. After that fairly dreadful Picard gauntlet, we jumped into Lower Decks with their premiere episode, Second Contact. Lower Decks is our adult animated comedy take on Star Trek, and our friend Andrea came on for that one. Andrea is a fan of Star Trek, particularly of TNG. And Andrea actually was previously on the podcast for the Lower Decks episode of TNG, the show that inspired the whole show in the first place. So, yeah, we got a nice little kind of like compare and contrast having her come on for both of those. I would say for Lower Decks, Andrea's response was somewhat positive. I would say somewhat positive. We definitely had a fun time with it. Not glowing in their praise. I think it's the kind of thing where just this is not necessarily. They had similar thoughts to, that Salem and Rachel had for Discovery, just in a different sense. They felt like, I don't know if this is Star Trek per se, but as a they had similar feelings on it as what Salem and Rachel thought of Discovery, in that Andrea also wasn't sure how much of this was a Star Trek show per se, but she definitely appreciated it more as just like an adult comedy set in space, but also did recognize and appreciate the Star Trek trapping. So yeah, I would say Andrea came away from that one feeling somewhat positive, but we definitely had a good time watching it. It is very silly. We also had a fun time with the next show, Prodigy, the Nickelodeon kids show. For that one, we sat down with Jenny's nephew Cash and his family to watch the premiere episode, Lost and Found. That was really fun. I was really hoping we could get like the target audience for that show, and we were able to sneak in a little recording when we were visiting them in California. Yeah, and I would say overall everyone was very positive on that one. It's a lovely little episode. Yeah, Cash, parents, Caitlin and Isaiah, Isaiah being someone who had grown up with Star Trek, hadn't seen it in a while, Caitlin being completely new to Star Trek, Cash also being completely new to Star Trek, but also the appropriate age, and everyone liked it. So a very positive response to Prodigy, which again is low-key secretly the best show of this whole era. And that is a hill I will die on. And then we finally ended with our 2020s redux of classic Trek, Strange New Worlds. both the series and the premiere episode of the same name. We had our good friend Andrew on for that one. Andrew is a fan of the show, but definitely a casual one. Kind of grew up a bit with Next Generation as a kid, and then being roommates all at the boys' house, definitely watched some episodes here and there with us from all across the franchise. So definitely has pretty good exposure to it, but isn't like a super hardcore fan. And our co-host emeritus, Aaron Cole, was back for that one as well. Him coming on as our hardcore fan watching this. We had to get at least one hardcore fan, because hardcore fans would definitely be coming to check this stuff out. I will say we were all very positive on that one as well. For me, surprisingly so. It was better than I remember it being when I first watched it, and I had not seen it since I watched it the first time, and I liked it the first time I watched it. But I was kind of like, it's fine. This time around, I definitely was much warmer on the episode. I thought it did a great job setting up the show, setting up Captain Pike. Also, a good little place for someone new to come in the modern day. Yeah, honestly, I think a pretty great episode of Star Trek. Not an all-timer or anything like that, and not even the best premiere of all of them, but I think pretty solid for what it is. So yes, a mixture of responses to the different shows of this modern era from our test audiences. Strange New Worlds walked away as the best received with an overall very positive response, which isn't terribly surprising. It seems to be the one doing the most to feel Star Trek-y for longtime fans, while also appealing to new viewers. After that, in descending order, we get, in second, Prodigy comes in with a just slightly under very positive. In third, Lower Decks gets a somewhat positive response. In fourth, we get Discovery coming in with a just slightly under somewhat positive response. In fifth, we get Star Trek 09, also with a just slightly under positive, a somewhat positive response. But just very slightly under Discovery, which was a little surprising. Rachel's enthusiastic response saved Discovery, and I think just the fact that we had a lot of serious nerds on for Star Trek 09 probably maybe brought it down a little more than how the average viewer might see it. In sixth, Short Treks gets a straight neutral response, which I got to be honest, for me, even though like it's not a negative response, being the straight neutral response really technically I feel like makes you the worst. Being middle of the road, boring mid, that's almost the worst. And then finally in seventh and last place, we get poor old Picard, with the needle headed into somewhat negative. An interesting ranking, to be sure. Definitely some surprises and non-surprises. If we're averaging all of these out, then I'd say the quality needle is hovering just under a somewhat positive reception, not quite neutral. This is not exactly a glowing response, but I'll be honest, it's a little more positive than I was anticipating. That being said, as far as I'm aware of this recording, none of our guests have continued exploring further with these shows, even those who were positive. Though I do believe Andrew is planning on watching more Strange New Worlds, so there's that. Now, to be clear, I should state we were only looking at the first episodes, first impressions of these shows. So these are not responses to these shows as a whole, just how they come across in their initial inceptions. If we looked at these shows as a whole, no doubt the responses would either get better or worse. I also mostly kept my feelings and responses out of these, with the exception of Children of Mars, as I was the only one watching that one. But otherwise, we focused more on what our test audiences felt. I think if we included my feelings, it would bring the averages down a bit for at least some of these shows, definitely overall. Yeah, modern Trek. I have mentioned it during this batch of episodes. This era is not my favorite. This is easily my least favorite of the three main eras of Star Trek. And while I have given this era the moniker of modern Trek, watching all of these together has really reinforced the idea to me that this is really postmodern Star Trek. This is the era of Star Trek being about itself. If we're looking back at the previous two eras, classic Trek, that's the trailblazing era where the franchise is really about those original characters, Kirk, Spock, Bones, the whole crew. Golden Age Trek is when the franchise is about building off of that original concept and expanding into new territory. TNG is all about exploring Star Trek beyond the original characters. DS9 is trying to push the franchise to its limits about what it can be while still being Star Trek. Voyager is trying to conceptually invert the premise. It's all about trying to get home rather than going out into space. And then Enterprise is exploring the origins of where all this comes from. What would the first Star Trek ship be? Modern Trek, or postmodern Trek, is more about the brand and deconstructing the IP. The reboot Star Trek movies are about reinterpreting the 60s show and characters, but as a Star Wars-like Hollywood blockbuster. Discovery starts out being Star Trek Game of Thrones, and then later transitions into being about the inclusivity and diversity of the franchise. Picard is all about deconstructing one of the franchise's most beloved characters in unexpected ways. Short Treks is Star Trek content. Lower Decks is the self-referential comedy that points out how silly the Star Trek universe is. Prodigy is maybe the most original and fresh concept, in my opinion. But this is the one that essentially reimagined Star Trek as a kid show. And then Strange New Worlds, again, it's a 2020s redux of the original 1960s show. Another reinterpretation of the 60s show. So, qualitatively, these shows all vary. But these are all essentially about Star Trek rather than just being a Star Trek show, which I think is its fundamental flaw. All of them, to varying degrees, they're more reactions to what has come before, or the franchise itself, or the pop culture perception of it. It's more about that rather than really wholly being their own new Star Trek shows. Now, it's not that you can't do this, and self-reflection and deconstruction can make for some great storytelling material. But if you rely on them, everything becomes too insular, I think. It's this weird situation where in their efforts to expand the brand, they make the ideas and the world smaller. It's very strange, and it's very ironic. In their attempt to expand the brand and find these new audiences, the shows are more referential to previous incarnations than ever before. It's very strange. So it's really hard to say how successful this era has been, particularly as we're still in it. It's always easier to look back after the fact when trying to analyze something like this. And the other eras, it's easy to do a retrospective on them because they're very solidly in the past, and more or less history has made up its mind about those shows. We're still kind of in this one. They have never really released the ratings for these shows either, so it's hard to really gauge their popularity. On some level, we have to assume there has been enough success to justify all these shows existing. But anecdotally speaking, Star Trek doesn't seem to have the same cultural footprint as it used to. For a lot of our newbies and casual fans watching these, talking about these shows with them, there only seemed to be a vague awareness of these shows, if at all. And I also hear stories of fan conventions in the current day where the average ages of these attendees is growing higher and higher. So it does seem that the franchise is struggling to bring in new and younger viewers. And on top of that, the fandom is also pretty split on this era, probably more than it ever has been, which is saying something. It's definitely gone through its divided fan eras. There are fans out there who lap all this stuff up. There are fans who stick with it all but have criticisms. There are fans who have moved on to other shows. And then there are fans who despise and or hate watch this stuff. And that's not necessarily surprising with splitting the franchise into multiple shows for different audiences. It's like you're inherently splitting up the fan base. And the varying quality doesn't help either. Oh, what a damn shame. But just going off these initial episodes, we are landing just under somewhat positive. So not terrible. Not terrible. I should also state, we technically haven't checked out everything from this era either. As of this recording, Star Trek Starfleet Academy is set to debut in 2026, so we do have yet another series on the horizon. There is also very short treks, which is similar to short treks. Those are specifically a small collection of tiny animated shorts on the Star Trek YouTube channel. But they do count toward the official episode count, which is bonkers. I tend to just wrap those in with short treks. It's just this kind of short Star Trek content. But those things aside, we have now watched a sampling of more or less everything in the Star Trek franchise. Wow. Crazy that we've made it this far. Before we wrap up this whole era, a couple of last points of podcast housekeeping. In previous batches, we have talked about our best and worst episodes of the batch. For the best episode, no surprise, I'm giving it to Strange New Worlds. Again, this was the only episode I was surprised by this batch. Everything else was more or less how I felt about them in the past, except for that one. I was surprised about how much more I liked it this time. Not perfect, but a really strong start for what that show is. For the worst episode, I am giving it to Maps and Legends, the second episode of Picard. Coming after the first episode of Picard, in which we were cautiously optimistic, Maps and Legends was such a drop in quality and investment. It was pretty staggering. Like, it just instantly plummets. Our friend Ellen said that she would have already been out by that point. So, yeah, not great. Not great. Lots of just plot, and exposition. Not good. Also in previous chunks, we have been stacking up our series leads against each other as we introduce them. In this chunk, we had 6 leads be introduced to us. So yeah, we'll go through this real quick. I have ranked them all. These will all be based on specifically what we have watched in this podcast and where we left off on all of them. This is also not a list of who makes the best captain per se, but the series lead. Again, so far. So the official Star Trek Stories ranking of all our series leads after this 100 episodes. Coming in at number 11, we have Dal from Prodigy. Dal's kind of annoying. He is probably the weakest point of Prodigy. He does get better as it goes, but he is a little annoying. So as much as I love Prodigy, I do think its lead Dal is its weakest point. So I'm giving it the 11th spot to him. At number 10, this is kind of an asterisk, but I'm old Picard from Star Trek Picard. Patrick Stewart is not quite who he used to be as a performer, which of course makes sense. And it's a very different kind of a show, and it's supposed to be about Picard in his twilight years. I just don't think the material is very strong. It's very strange. It feels very off-putting. I feel like we're kind of off with Picard, and he's not exactly giving a tour de force. He's fine. He's great, but not exactly elevating the material. So it's kind of a disappointment. So I'm giving him the number 10 spot. 9, I'm giving to Mariner from Lower Decks. I will say if this list was encapsulating everything, Mariner would be higher. But in this first episode, and Andrea said as much, like Mariner comes across as very chaotic, and it's hard to get any kind of grounded with her. She is fun, but is a bit chaotic. So I'm giving number 9 to Mariner. 8, I'm giving to Chris Pine's reboot Kirk from the reboot films. This is a case where I think he's giving a very charismatic performance and is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, but especially in that first film, I don't think young Kirk is written particularly well. He's just kind of a spoiled, bratty, I don't know, prodigy captain. I don't know. He feels like a frat boy who just gets everything handed to him. So Chris Pine does a great performance. The character he's playing isn't particularly great or compelling, I would say. 7, gonna give to Archer from Enterprise. Mark and I definitely gave Archer a hard time in those first 5 episodes. It's part of this is intentional. He is supposed to be a green, doesn't have any experience, is making this up as he goes, but he's also fairly reckless and dangerous, and I don't think the show adequately addresses it. And Scott Bakula is good. He's very charming. He's fine. Wouldn't say he's elevating the material, but he's fine. 6, I'm going to give to Burnham from Discovery. Burnham is also a problematic leader, but unlike Enterprise, Discovery actually deals with it and makes it front and center. So while they're a flawed leader, if this were like best captain or best leader, they would be much lower at this point. But if we're going off a series lead, they are interesting, and the show gives them some conflict to have to kind of rise above. And I think Sonequa Martin Green does a great job in playing her. So I want to give Burnham 6. Number 5, I want to give Cisco. Again, if I were doing an overall ranking with all the shows in mind, he would probably be higher than 5. But we're just going off of him in our podcast, which is essentially seasons 1 and 2 Cisco. I think Cisco is really strong in the first episode, but he kind of really quickly kind of blends into the ensemble and isn't quite the leader he eventually does become. Part of this is that he does kind of grow into it organically in the show, but I do think the writers kind of let him down a little bit, because Avery's great, but he just kind of is written so he kind of blends into the background a little bit. So still a really strong, striking presence, but I'm going to give him 5. 4, I'm going to give to Pike from Strange New Worlds. We only watched one episode. I should say technically we did watch 2 episodes. We did watch The Cage. The very first episode in Classic Trek is the Captain Pike episode. So, but really going off of Anson Mount's performance in Strange New Worlds, the show does a really good job in the first episode of setting up his character, making him a compelling character, making him an interesting character. And I think Anson Mount really elevates the material. So in one episode, he makes a pretty strong impression. So I'm going to give him 4. 3, I'm going to give to Janeway. Janeway is kind of written all over the place a bit over the course of the whole show. We're only looking at, again, her tenure on the podcast, seasons 1 and 2. I just think Kate Mulgrew is such a strong presence. She's so fun. She is playing that to a 10 all the time. Also a case of where the actor is really elevating the material, and I think Janeway's great. She's really fun. She's a strong presence. I think she's great. 2, I'm going to give to Kirk from the original series. Kirk is my childhood hero, so really he's my personal favorite, number 1. William Shatner is effortlessly charming as Captain Kirk. He makes it look, it just makes it look easy, but he's so dynamic. You can't keep your eyes off him. We don't get a lot of like character growth per se with Kirk. We did get little snippets of his performances throughout 3 seasons. He's fairly consistently Captain Kirk. So that kind of staticness kind of maybe keeps him from the number 1 spot, at least at this point. But Shatner's Kirk is phenomenal. He's a lot of fun to watch. Sometimes does ham it up as well, so that might bring him down a point. And then coming in at number 1, shocking no one, Jean-Luc Picard from The Next Generation. This is almost a default win because we watched 40 episodes of Next Generation, but even so, Patrick Stewart and Picard, he's written well, he's performed really well. He's just an outstanding and a compelling lead. Hard character to pull off. In so many ways, he's such an ideal, and it'd be easy for that to be boring. And on some level, there is a kind of boringness to his character, but it's played so well and interesting that it's hard to give this to anyone else than Picard. So, yeah, Captain Picard, after 100 episodes, comes away as the great captain. Shout out to Jean-Luc Picard. All right. I think we'll wrap up this batch here. Modern Trek. What a strange mixed bag of postmodernist content farming sensibilities. Academically interesting, though. Academically interesting. I will be curious to see years from now, when we're looking back on this whole era, what the general consensus becomes. I remember Enterprise back in the day being either pretty derided or left to the curb by the fandom. But now 20 years on has had a bit of a resurgence in popularity and has had but now 20 years on, it's had a bit of a resurgence in popularity, and there has been some amount of critical reappraisal. So, yeah, I wonder if anything like that is going to happen with some of these shows. Anyway, Modern Trek, what a time. I will say it's kind of strange with our last episode, Strange New Worlds, even though we were all very positive on that. I will say, now that we're finished, it's kind of strange that we're ending on essentially a version of the 60s show. It's I don't know. It's for a franchise that's about exploring into strange new worlds. It seems like we've just come right back to the beginning. So I don't know. We'll see. Well, now that Modern Trek is in the bag, we have officially finished our 100 episode list, our giant overview of the entire Star Trek franchise from 1964 to 2022. now that we have completed our journey and it's all out there, next time we are going to be doing a little retrospective on this entire list we have watched. We're going to break it all down, talk about the thought process behind the list, go over our journey, chat with some of our co-hosts and guests, and talk about what we learned on Star Trek Stories. Very exciting times. I hope you will all be there for that. If it's not out next week, it will be coming very soon. So be on the lookout. I am trying to make a little special out of it. So if it's not out next week, just give it a little time. Alrighty, everyone at home. Thank you so much for going on this journey of modern Trek and this whole 100 episode list. If you've been here this whole time, it's been lovely to have you on this silly little podcast looking at this silly little franchise. All right, everyone. Next time, our 100 episode special. Looking forward to it. We will see you all then. Bye-bye.